Ian Sean Jones of Pampa, Texas, died Sunday, September 8th, 2024, in Pampa at the age of 44 years, 2 months, and 21 days. Services will be held at 10 a.m. on Friday at Carmichael Watley Funeral Home in Pampa, Texas. Burial will follow at Memory Garden Cemetery, also in Pampa. Ian was born Monday, June 16, 1980, in Pampa to Timothy Allen and Sherry K. Jones. He grew up in Pampa until moving to Allison, Texas in 1991 after his dad, Tim, remarried. Ian graduated from Allison High School and attended Clarendon College, where he studied music. While attending Clarendon, he met the love of his life, Toya. Ian and Toya married on June 8, 2002, and were married for 24 years. She served and loved him as her husband above and beyond and wasn't afraid to help him see his shortcomings. Ian eventually moved back to Pampa to work as a carpenter for his dad. Ian carpooled to work with his uncle Leslie, who he talked scripture with almost every day, and eventually dedicated his life to Jesus Christ. After a few months, Ian began preaching and eventually started traveling with Jerry McCorkle to train as an evangelist. Ian began working as a full-time evangelist in 2011 after spending several years training under Sean Zybach, who would also become his best friend. Ian's passion in life was preaching the gospel. Ian spent a great deal of his time traveling all over the United States, holding gospel meetings, singing instructions, and training and ordaining leadership in churches. Ian also enjoyed golfing, singing, and playing guitar. What Ian treasured most was spending time with his family. Ian and Toya were blessed with 3 children who were his pride and joy. He loved doing anything with his son Van, whether it involved guns, bows, fishing, or sports. Some of his best years were being able to spend so much time with Van, especially when he traveled to meetings with him or went rabbit and coyote hunting late at night. He loved his daughter Kennedy's meekness, creativity, humor, beautiful singing voice, and a resolve to never conform to pressure. The kids often joked that she was his favorite child because he favored her so highly. He loved Olivia's strength, her wit, her curiosity, and her ability to bring joy to every person she encountered. He often said she had a God-given gift to make people feel loved and important, including himself. He is preceded in death by his grandparents, Coy and Laverne Potter, his papa, Raymond Jones, who was his hero, and his stepmother, Deborah Jones. He is survived by his wife, Toya, a son, Van, 2 daughters, Kennedy and Olivia, all of Pampa, his grandmother, Murtis Jones of Pampa, his parents, Timothy Jones of Pampa, Texas, and Sherry Jeffries of Elk City, Oklahoma, his sister and brother-in-law, Heather Shields, and husband, Kevin, his brother, Bo Jones of Weatherford, Oklahoma, a sister, Candace Jeffries of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and numerous in-laws, nieces, and nephews, aunts and uncles, and brothers and sisters in Christ. How does that make you feel? It doesn't make me feel too good. And not that it's Ian. It does make me feel bad that it's Ian, for the record. But when we see somebody that we love who's passed away, and specifically we come sit in a church or a funeral home and we have this memorial service to their life, and we have somebody read an obituary, and it's, what was that, a few paragraphs? And for today, Ian's life gets reduced to 4 paragraphs. That is insane. I've spent a fair amount of time with Ian. I could tell you a bunch of stories, and it'd last a lot longer than this obituary lasted. And many of you have spent a lot of hours and time with him and could tell story after story after story. Things you did and places you went and embarrassing things. This morning we're going to talk about death. And not because it's fun or enjoyable, but because I believe it's important that we wrap our minds around death. That we wrap our minds around what death is. As humans, we have this portrayal, this view of death, and I'm not so sure that it's very accurate or what death should be looked at as. You know, when I Googled the word death, some of the first 4 or 5 of the first 10 pictures were the Grim Reaper. the skull with the bones crossing, a dark, creepy graveyard at night, and a candle that had been blown out. Is that death? Is that what God thinks of when He thinks of death? Is that God's portrayal of death for us as Christians? Yet we see movies, we see television and the internet, and this is what we think of with death. Halloween is a major, I'm blanking on the word. Halloween's a major tradition in the United States, holiday. And this is what we think of. This is what we like about Halloween, that it's dark and it's creepy and it has this undertone of death. But today, I don't think that's what the Christians should think about when they think about death. And I'm hoping that throughout our study this morning, that I can prove that and that we can go over and talk about that. So why talk about death? Why talk about death? Very simply, death is coming. And one of these days, in a much more realistic sense, not for a sermon, not as to get your attention at the beginning of a lesson, one of these days, this will be up on a screen somewhere. And Ian will be in a wooden box, and they'll roll his body in that box up to the front of some room, and some man will stand up and read that obituary. Maybe that exact one, I don't know. And when you think about that, you can't help but think about one of these days, I'm going to be in the box. And they'll roll me in the front of a bunch of people, maybe some people will be there. And you can't help but think about the fact that your death is impending. Beyond that, just not the fact that death is coming, but life is a vapor. We have people here, I'm assuming, not going to take a survey, that are in their 90s, and I'm assuming every decade down, and we have children in the audience today that are below the age of 10. We've got people here of every age, just about. And I suppose anybody in that 90 to 75-year-old category would confirm and tell you that life is a vapor. You know, the oldest woman alive at the time I put this sermon together, she may not be alive anymore. She's 117 years old. She was born in 1907, lives in Spain. That's the age of my great-grandparents. My great-grandpa was born in 1907. He'd be 117 years old if he was alive today. And I assume that she would tell you, if you could speak to this woman in Spain, I suppose she would tell you that life is a vapor. I'm assuming she would tell you that 117 years goes by very quickly. And we've all seen that in our own lives, haven't we? Just how quickly life goes by. How a week turns into months, and months turn into years. And next thing you know, you're 117 years old. But beyond that death is coming, that death is coming quickly because life is a vapor, it's important to understand that death is the usher to eternity. That death is the usher to Judgment Day. And that the decisions that we make in this life that happen so quickly and that pass us by so quickly, that they can't be undone. That we can't change the decisions that we've made. Whenever we read about the rich man and Lazarus, there's something that has always stuck out to me. He's the rich man, he wants to leave this place of torment, right? And he says, I want to go tell my brothers about this. I want to tell them that this is real, and I want to warn them, and I want to teach them. And he's told that he can't do that. That there's been, what is said, a great gulf that has been fixed between him and Lazarus, speaking. And that there's no going back. There's no swapping. And in other words, what he's told is, it's done. It's game over. You don't get any more redos. You don't get any more retries. Your life has been lived. You made the decisions you wanted to make. And now you will get what you deserve. And all those things are important because eternity is real. You know, we are human and we only know physical life. And as much as I want to or try to think about it, I cannot wrap my mind around eternity, really. And I don't suppose the human mind is really capable of understanding eternity. But what I do know is I know this physical life, and it's very real. And if I slap myself in the face, it will hurt because this is real. And the things I do in my life, they're real. They have real consequences. But as real as this life is, eternity is realer. It's more realer than this physical life that we live right now. And that's hard for us to understand, that one of these days we're going to live in eternity, and it's going to be more real than what we're living right now, right here. It is what real life is. This is not as real. I don't know that I can wrap my mind around that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, it says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad." And since eternity is real, and since judgment is real, and since death is coming, one of these days, I will stand before God. And you will stand before God. And there won't be any more redos. There won't be any more start agains. You can't go get more lives. It's not a video game. And when I stand before God, and when you stand before God on Judgment Day, this verse here says, you're going to get what you deserve. That what you deserve is what is going to happen, whether that be good or bad. Why talk about death? It's a very significant milestone in life, in eternity. I very easily could make this a hellfire brimstone kind of sermon, and I don't want to do that, and that's not my intention this morning. Nathan Springer preached at Wheeler years ago, and it really stuck out to me, this one thing he spoke of about heaven and hell, and I want to relay that to you briefly in fewer words. Heaven is heaven because that's where God is. And hell is hell because that's not where God is. God is not there. And that's what makes heaven heaven, and that's what makes hell hell. And so, in light of trying not to make this a hellfire and brimstone sermon, I want to make this a sermon that motivates you with heaven, and not one that motivates you with fear of hell, which motivates me greatly, if I'm being honest. But let's try this morning, as much as I don't want to go to hell, let's want to go to heaven, because that's where God is. Let's want to be with God more than we don't want to be away from God. Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." Let's be motivated this morning with heaven. Let's be motivated this morning with being where God is. So we've got 5 points that we're going to talk about this morning. 5 points that your death is. 5 points that death in general are. Your death is, number one, it's God's plan. It's God's plan that you have a death and that you die. Your death is fair. It's a fair thing that we all have to die. Your death is inevitable. Your death is a reminder. And finally, we'll close with talking about how our death and death in general is viewed differently by God than it is by us as humans. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse number 2 says, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Very simple. We all understand this, right? We all have a time in our life that we're born. We all have a time in our life that we are going to die. And that's just part of it. We couldn't stop being born just the same way we can't stop dying. We have no control over either one of those things. And once again, we have people of every generation and decade here in our attendance today. And we're all at a different point in our lives. Some of us have lived the majority of our lives, and some of the people here, our lives are just getting started. My son Zane is 20 months old. He's just had his time to be born. He's got a whole life ahead of him. My grandmother just passed away a few months ago, and her life is over. She's had that time, and she has fulfilled God's plan in that. We recognize death so much, and death is everywhere around us, and we have to teach our children about death, whether we like it or not, from a very young age. Z, like I say, he's 20 months old, and we've already had to teach him about death, right? He likes to go and play with the grasshoppers. He comes up and hands it to you, and, hey, bud, you killed it. You mashed it. It's dead now. You can no longer play with this because you have ruined the game now. Goes and picks up a bug and wants to hand it to Mama. Yep, it's dead. You've already crushed it now. And you got to kind of teach them about that. And we teach our children as they get a little bit older about death. There's people in their lives that pass away, and much simpler, they go to the fair, they get the little fish, right? And you go in there like 2 days later, and it's upside down in its tank, and you go into the bathroom and you have a miniature fish funeral right there in the bathroom, and you have to teach your children that this is part of life. This is something that happens. And it's good that we can teach it with grasshoppers and fish, but in a much more real sense, that child is going to encounter death throughout its whole life. Pets are going to die. People are going to die. And it's good for us to understand that. I think it's helpful for us to understand that. We've been in Wheeler for a little over 11 years. We've been in the new church building there. That's gone by very quickly, right? Just over 11 years. And in that time, we've had 18 members pass away. We've had 18 funerals. And in reality, we've had more than that. We've had people that we loved and cared about who are very dear to the congregation, who maybe didn't necessarily attend with us, but we had their funerals, and a lot of people that we loved, a lot of people that we cared about. And I suppose you could probably do something very similar here over the last 10 or 11 years. These are people we loved, and they fulfilled God's plan. But can't we be so happy about that? It's hard to. But they fulfilled God's plan. They've had their time to be born. They've had their time to live their life. And now that time has come to an end. And we can be thankful that they have seen part of God's creation that we have not seen. Amen. That they have lived their life to completion and fulfilled that. If you go through the next 11 years, we may have 36. It's part of God's plan. It's a normal thing. Ecclesiastes 9, verse number 5 says, "For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." I really want to focus on that last phrase there, "for the memory of them is forgotten." Oh, the living know they shall die. We understand that. The dead, they have not a reward anymore. What that means is there's no more consequences. There's no more actions. Their life is ended. For the memory of them is forgotten. And if you go back and you look at these people here on this screen, some of these people died close to 11 years ago. And some of these people have passed away recently, and then everywhere in between. And what's left of them now is memory. And the Bible says that the memory of them will be forgotten. You know, there were some very important people that lived hundreds of years ago that we never talk about, that we never think about. And these people here, I love them. I love them to death. I'd never say a bad word about them. You know what? They're going to be forgotten. They're not important in the grand scheme of life. They were important to some people. I'm not important. And whenever I die, it may not be that long before I'm just absolutely forgotten. And that's a very humbling thing for us to think about and realize that we have one purpose in life. To be obedient to God, because as soon as you die, you're done. It's over. People forget you. How often do you stand around adults and tell stories and bring up somebody, and half the room does not remember that person? It happens so often. Many of you may know Brother Curtis Hall, a dear member, a great uncle of mine. He was a veteran, and so on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, we go out and we place flags on the headstones at the cemetery. And so we place a flag on his headstone. And about a year after he passed away, we had some young people that went and helped us that were members of our church. And Dad stopped with one of them in front of Uncle Curtis's grave and said, "This is Uncle Curtis, remember him?" He said, "No." He said, "How quickly the memory of people is forgotten." And that's just part of it. That's just part of the natural part of life. It's God's plan that we be forgotten. He says the memory of them is forgotten. It's a shame that Zealand will never know Merle Fielder. He will hear stories, but his memory will be forgotten. I want you to take a good look around the room, and I'm not just saying that. I mean, I really want you to take a good look around the room here. Look at the people next to you. Turn around if you want to. Look at everybody that's here. Because one of these days, you'll come in and they won't be here. They'll be gone. That's just a natural part of life. And as I got to thinking that through, I realized that a little exercise. Let's think about 100 years from today, if it's a Sunday. 100 years from now, you know what? Every last person in this room will be at the cemetery. Unless Zealand lives to be 102, every last one of us in 100 years will be in the cemetery. And if this building is still standing, I pray that it's full of people. But if it is, it's going to be full of people that we don't know. People whose names we've never heard. And whenever they bring up Ian Jones, they'll go, "Who?" I think I heard Grandpa say something about him once. You know, if Zealand lives to be 80, in 100 years, he'll have been gone for 20 years. People get forgotten in 20 years. The homes that we live in, if they're still standing, will be lived in by strangers. The cars that we spend a lot of money on and drive, they'll be mashed into those rectangles that you see on TV. I've never seen one of those in real life. I suppose they're out there. The phones that we're all carrying, every one of us, got a $1,000 phone in our pocket. They'll be in the landfill. The clothes that we wore over and over again in life, they'll be at the landfill. All our belongings, gone. This is God's plan. And time goes on. You know, I brought a Cool Whip bowl of my knickknacks. Maybe you have one of these at home. I've got several of these, and I condensed it down so that I don't stand here and tell you stories for an hour or something. But I've got a little Bible that was given to me when I was born. A little New Testament there. And that's a good memory for me. My grandmother embroidered my name on this little heart. Very 90s, isn't that? Never got put on a shirt, thankfully. I've got some wallets that are full of hotel cards, from Hawaii, Florida, a bunch of other places. I've got movie stubs from college. I've got free Chick-fil-A coupons from college that I liked them better than getting something free, so I kept them. I've got a junior high football pin there, one from Hallie and I's honeymoon. Old licenses. There's a hotel card from Hawaii. College IDs. Confetti from a Thunder game. I sprayed that in Brenton's mouth before he kissed Jinsey at his wedding. I got a lock. I was rooming with Jonathan Murphy in college, and before I moved out, I went and found his engagement ring. He hadn't proposed yet, and I went and put a lock on it, and I moved out and left. So I got my lock back. I've got a class ring, Ian. We went to the Vanilla Moose in Aztec, New Mexico with Van and Dad, and they gave us boys one of these, and I thought that was cooler than a free ice cream cone, so I kept that. But you know what this is? It's garbage. That's what it is. It's garbage. This is my life in a Cool Whip bowl. This is so much better than an obituary. That's my life. Some of it. It's just memories, and they'll all be forgotten. And your Cool Whip bowl at home, they'll pull it out one of these days when you're dead and gone, and they'll go, "What in the world?" And they'll throw it out. They'll throw it out. Because your memory will be forgotten. All the memories you had, they'll be gone. That's God's plan. That's God's plan, and that makes me want to live life for something more important. Amen. Death is fair, and I mean that in a couple ways. Death is fair in that it's fair that we die. We deserve it. But also, death is equal for all of us. For every person that's ever lived, death is equal. I'm Zane, and I'm not a wealthy man. I'm a very average, normal person, and I keep my things in a Cool Whip bowl in the closet, and I'm just normal. Elon Musk, not a normal man. Not a normal man, a very wealthy man, worth $250 billion whatever dollars. Knows a lot of powerful people, does a lot of very important things, will be remembered far longer than I will be remembered. But death is fair because you know what? I'm going to die, and Elon Musk is going to die. And we're both going to be put in that wooden box, and we're both going to have a funeral, and we're both going to be buried in the ground and be just as dead and stand in front of God all the same at Judgment Day. And while Elon may have a nicer box and there may be better people at his funeral, we'll be just as dead. Death is very fair. We're both going to have to die. Just for everybody, it's all the same. Death doesn't care how powerful you are, how important you are, how much stuff you have, or how many friends you have. Death is fair also in that we deserve it. In Romans chapter 5 and verse number 12, it says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." And one of these days, that obituary of Ian is going to be read, and Ian's going to be in the box at the front during the cemetery because Ian has sinned. Hope you don't mind me saying that. And one of these days, you and I are going to have our funeral because you know what? We've all sinned, and we deserve it. It's fair. In fact, the most fair thing possible would be for each and every one of us to drop dead right this very instant. That's what we deserve. Because we've all got sin. We've lived lives of sin. We've been disobedient to God when we didn't have to be. And we deserve to die. Death is fair. I got to thinking about the most prevalent fears that people have. And while I Didn't really Google this or do much research. I just thought about some in my own head, so maybe these are accurate or not, I don't know. But some of the most prevalent fears are the fear of heights. You've probably seen this photo before. I think it was New York, maybe the Empire State Building, I don't know. A big skyscraper in New York, and the guys, eating their lunch on that. And if you have the fear of heights, this is probably very disturbing to you, to think about those men up there on that I-beam enjoying their lunch. I'm not necessarily afraid of heights, and it kind of scares me thinking about it. This is the one that gets me. Claustrophobia, fear of tight spaces. Have you ever heard of spelunking? That's what this is. Spelunking is going down into these caves and seeing how far you can get and exploring all these caves. I don't know why anybody in their right mind would do that. I don't like elevators, and I avoid them at all cost. I avoid elevators. And I avoid going underneath the house. I avoid climbing in the attic. And my size lends me to do that a lot of times. So I've been underneath my sister and brother-in-law's house a bunch lately. They're replumbing some things, and I'm the only one that can fit up in there. It's awful. Fear of snakes. Everybody's a little scared of snakes, right? Spiders. Everybody's a little afraid of spiders. But I did Google this one, the most prevalent fear in the United States, public speaking. Well, you got me. That is, I'm surprised to hear that. These are the things people are afraid of. But as I got to thinking about those fears, if you really wanted to, you could never public speak. You could get out of that. You could avoid that at all costs. Spiders, snakes, you could stay away from them. Anytime you saw one or came near one, you could just leave, get away from it. You hear the jokes about people burning their house down when they find a spider. If you really wanted to stay away from spiders, you could do that. That's an option. Spelunking, you don't have to do that. You don't have to go underneath the house. I could refuse. I could hire somebody, just the same as getting on something high, fixing something on the roof, or going up in the elevators. You could, your whole life, you really could, you could go without doing any of these things or any other fear that you come up with. But you're going to die. And that's one of the other most prevalent fears, is fear of death. And as hard as you wanted to, and as much as you tried, you could keep from public speaking and stay away from spiders and snakes and not go in caves or elevators or any tight spaces. You could stay from going up on tall things. You could be scared of death, but you're going to die. No matter what you do, you're going to die. It's inevitable. Snakes aren't inevitable. Claustrophobia is not inevitable. Heights aren't inevitable. Public speaking is not inevitable. Death is inevitable. I heard it said, if you eat the most healthy diet possible and hire personal chefs and everything to only feed you the most optimum diet that a human could possibly eat. And if you hire personal trainers and you work out each and every day all the core muscles and you have the perfect workout regime and diet, that you will die healthy. How about that? Isn't that great? It's inevitable. I'm going to die. And that one single thought, honestly, since putting this sermon together, has been very helpful to me. I'm going to die. Hebrews 9, verse number 27 says, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment." You have an appointment with death. And it's an eerie thought, but that appointment's been set. And we don't know when that's going to be. All we know is that we have the assurance that we will keep it. That we will keep that appointment that we have. Just as all the people before us have passed away, they had their appointment and they kept it. I can't stress enough how important it is to wrap your mind around the fact that you will die. As younger people, often we think, oh, that's something to worry about way off in the future. But in reality, the sooner you can get your mind wrapped around that, the better. Number 4, death is a reminder. And these kind of go hand in hand with the fact that death is inevitable. Psalms 90 and verse number 12 says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." I said it was very important and very helpful for me just to have that thought that I'm going to die and get myself wrapped around that fact. Why? This verse tells us all we need to know why. Teach us to number our days. Teach us to realize that we're going to die. Have that thought, realize that, understand that, and live every day with that perspective. And you know what that's going to do? That's going to apply your heart to wisdom. For me, the fact that I know I'm going to die, it makes me make better choices. It makes me make better choices. It makes me make wiser choices. It makes me want to do good things. It makes me want to do helpful things. It makes me want to stay away from sin and temptation. Because I'm going to die. And as we talked about with the rich man and Lazarus and some of our introduction, we understand that that's the usher to judgment. And I don't know when I'm going to die, so I need to make good choices. You know, we place a lot of importance on birthdays, and we celebrate birthdays. And here in a few months, we'll celebrate my son's 2nd birthday, and it'll be a big celebration, and we're so excited about that. And as you get older, they're just not as important, right? Everybody goes through that. It's just not quite as big of a deal. But I would say as old as you get, you probably still have some idea of when your birthday is and when it's coming up and as it's approaching. Now, I'll be 29 years old. I still got this internal clock of my birthday coming up. And I kind of got an idea. And not that I'm keeping track of it or that I care, because I really don't. But you could ask me at any time throughout the year, and I could probably, in just a second, tell you about how far away I was from my birthday. And while I'm not thinking about it as the new year, I was born in March, as the new year comes around, I realize, hey, I'm just a couple months away from my birthday now. And I've got this internal clock, and I take for granted and I assume that everybody's kind of that same way. But what if you knew your death day? What if you knew the day you would die? I was born on March 2nd, 1996, but what if they came around and said, hey, you're going to die September, what's today, the 8th or the 9th? I forgot, the 8th, I think. What if you're going to die September 9th, tomorrow? And what if I knew that from years ago? Do you think you'd have an idea of that day as it got closer? You think you'd be a little bit aware of that? You think that would make you number your days? You think that would make you apply your heart to wisdom? If I knew that I was going to die tomorrow, I would be so aware of that. I'd be so aware of September 9th, 2024. It would be seared into my brain. And I would make good choices if I knew. As the new year, as 2024 rolled onto the calendar, I would be so aware of September 9th. As January turns into February, into March and April and May and June, and you just see the day getting closer and closer. When August flipped over to September, you'd pray. You'd lay awake at night, and you'd You'd plead with God for forgiveness. You'd beg Him. You'd go and ask forgiveness from people. You'd forgive people who'd done things wrong to you. You'd go to church. You'd open up your Bible at home and you'd read it. You'd read and you'd read. As you saw that death day get closer, you would incline your heart to wisdom. What a great reminder that would be if we could know that. Ecclesiastes 7:2 said, "It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart." You know, we don't like to think about unpleasant things. They're unpleasant. We like to think about happy things, and we like to do things that make us feel good. We don't like to do things that don't make us feel good. You know, every time I go to a funeral, specifically the graveside, it reminds me of my funeral, or makes me think of my funeral, I guess I should say. It makes me look forward to my funeral and think about that, and I wonder who will be there and who will speak and who all will be crying, who won't care. It makes me think about these things. But it makes me think about my actions. It makes me think about how I'm living my life. It makes me think about what I'm prioritizing. When I go to somebody else's funeral, I can't help but think about myself. Maybe that's very self-centered, I don't know. It seems natural to me just to look at my own funeral and think about that. You know what that is? That's what we're reading here in Ecclesiastes 7. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. It's better sometimes for us to make ourselves think about some things that are unpleasant. It's better for us sometimes to wrap our mind around the fact that we're going to have this funeral and that it's going to be real. Other people's death can be a great reminder for us. I encourage you to use that as motivation the next time you're at one, to evaluate yourself and evaluate the way you're living, the things that you prioritize, the things that you don't. Not only can other people's death be a reminder, but just as we spoke about before, our own death, knowing that our death is coming up whether we know that day or not. Death is a great reminder for us because it helps us apply our hearts to wisdom, and it helps the living lay it to his heart for us to think about some of these things that are maybe a little bit unpleasant. Death is a great, great reminder. And finally this morning, death is different to God than it is to you and I. And I've already made a couple comments about how we're human, we're physical. All we know is this physical life. And we shouldn't be surprised that God looks at death differently than you and I do, typically. Some things we've got to understand is that God is not bound by time or by a clock like we as humans are. Our lives revolve around a clock. And everything we do is in the time frame of time. I'm very aware of time. Very aware. You could ask my wife. I'm very aware of time. If I drop her off to go into Dollar General and I stay in the car, I am watching the clock. I came back in, it was 6.5 minutes. I think you can do better. God's not bound by time. We often say at a funeral, hey, it was their time to go. Well, I wish they had more time. I can't believe their time is up, or something like that. We revolve around time. But God doesn't. And I think we have to get ourselves in that mindset if we want to view death how God views death. And that's one of the goals of this sermon is that we view death the same way that God views death. If we go back a verse from the one we just read there, Ecclesiastes 7:1 says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth." What? Right there, that proves it to me that we view death differently than God. God says that the day of death is better than the day of birth. Well, that's very foreign to us. I've been to quite a few funerals. I'm sure you have too. I've never gone to a funeral and looked at that and said, better than his birth. This is a better day than the day that he was born. That's so foreign. That's so odd to think about that. But the Bible says that death is better than birth. But really, that just puts everything into perspective for us. It doesn't mean that birth is bad. The day of one's birth is such a great day. Such an amazing day. Such an exciting day. But we need to get in perspective how much better death is for the Christian than birth. And what this made me realize, and I hope that I can prove this through our next several slides here as we begin to close, but we view birth the way God views death as humans. We view birth the way God views death. That's really interesting to me. The importance that we place on birth, God places that importance on death. The wonders of birth that we place, God places those wonders on death. And part of that's probably because of the TVs and the movies and everything, like I showed you there at the beginning, the Grim Reaper and the candle blown out and etc. And Satan answered the Lord. I won't read all this. Job's been tempted, and you know the picture. Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath, he will give for his life. But put forth thy hand now and touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face." Rule of thumb, if Satan says something, let's not believe it, for one. Because we have an eternal perspective. And I'm glad Job had an eternal perspective, a spiritual perspective. But the fact is, if we don't have an eternal perspective, if we have a worldly perspective and we live a worldly life, then we need to take Satan's advice here. You need to give everything you've got for your physical life if you don't have an eternal perspective, because it's all you get. It's as good as it's going to get with a worldly mindset, a worldly life. You need to give up everyone. You need to go enjoy every pleasure that comes across. You need to live your life for nothing but joy and pleasure here, physically, if you've got a worldly perspective. But God doesn't look at it that way, right? And sometimes I think we look at death as this bad thing, as this mysterious thing, as this dark thing. And I think that's just proof that we don't quite have the right viewpoint on death. That we don't quite view death the way that God does. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say death is great and death is wonderful and that here in this life we should enjoy death and be thankful for it. We should with the eternal perspective. Don't get me mixed up there. But we should have that eternal perspective. We should strive to look at things the way God does. We should understand what death is, where death takes us. Like I said, I'm not saying that death isn't sad. Jesus proved that in John 11:35 when Lazarus died. And it says, Jesus wept. I don't suppose Jesus had a physical approach or mindset to this. I don't think that's the problem here, and so I'm not saying if you cry at a funeral that you've got an earthly mindset. That's not the point. Jesus cried at a funeral, if you will. And we cry at funerals, and you often sit at the back of a funeral and you look up there at the front and the close family, and they're crying, and you know the same thing that those in the audience knew about Jesus when Lazarus died. The Jews said, "Behold how he loved him." He loved him. And when we cry at funerals, it's because we love him. And we know we're here on this earth. It's not going to be the same. Our final verse for this morning is kind of the culmination of the whole sermon, the point of the whole sermon, the one that got me thinking about this and really contemplating death. Psalms 116, verse number 15 says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." We hear it read at a bunch of funerals, don't we? It's the number one verse to read, and for a good reason. It's a great verse. It's one that helps us get in that mindset that God has and out of the mindset that the flesh has. It's the mindset that gives us the eternal perspective and takes away that short perspective that's based on time, that's based on physical, that's based on what we know in this here and now life. And it's very similar to what we read in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse number 1, that the day of death is better than the day of birth. That word precious there, it translates valuable. Valuable. Valuable in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. It's a valuable thing. It holds great value. It's costly. It's excellent. When God sees a Christian die, he sees excellence. He sees value. He sees security. And when we see these people that we love die, and when we go to their funerals, and more importantly, more specifically, when we see them on their deathbed and we see their death getting closer and closer, and we look at that person there and we see somebody that's weak. We see someone that's vulnerable. And we feel sorry for them. And we hate that, and we don't want them to be in pain. Of course, we see them there laying there in that hospital bed or at home or whatever it is, and it's so sad as we see their life coming to an end, as we see their flesh failing, because they're so weak. That we know there's nothing you can do, that it is inevitable at this point. And we cry and we're sad over that. But what does God see? God sees a Christian who's so close to the goal. He sees someone who's never been stronger. He sees someone who's about to be finished. Like I said, we view birth the way God views death, and that got me to thinking about that dynamic there. When Zane, before he was born, we made a lot of preparations for the kiddo. We remodeled a room for him. We brought in the crib and put it all together, and we spent, hours and hours getting that room ready. We had baby showers to get gifts for them, and we started setting back money and doing all the things that I'm sure that y'all did when you had children. And the number one thing that was said after he was born was, he's precious. He's precious. And I suppose they were right. I'm not going to disagree. I think he's precious. But as precious as he is, it'll be better when he dies. It'll be better. What a bizarre thought. We had highs and we had lows as we were waiting for Zealand to come. Hallie would throw up in the middle of the night, and I'd clean it up. It gets pretty low when you're cleaning up vomit at 2 a.m. Not enjoyable. But there were some great things that came out of that. When you're cleaning up someone's vomit at 2 a.m., you know he loves you. When she's pregnant and hurting and hungry and grouchy, and she's folding my clothes or doing the dishes, I know she loves me. I know this now. And so there were good things that came out of that. There were bad things, there were good things. Like I said, we prepped for the room, and people told us we can't wait for him to be here. And we knew he was right there, but they said we can't wait for him to be out here with us, like everybody else. As his dad, I wanted to hold him. I wanted to take care of him because he's mine. I wanted to know he was safe and healthy. He was in our control. And now I think that's how God views that Christian. He sees their highs and their lows of their life. He was there. He was watching the whole time. He saw when they were disobedient and didn't love him and didn't care about him. He saw when they dedicated their life to him. He saw when they were obedient and they didn't have to be. And then he sees them on their deathbed. And he knows they're so close. And it's precious because he just wants them to be with him. As the Father, he wants to take care of them and know that they're safe in his arms. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of the saint. If only we could have that perspective. In closing this morning, I want you to go ahead and get your songbooks out. For one more minute, imagine with me, if you will, your death day. Not this mysterious day in the future, not something that's unknown. If you will, if you'll humor me, please, imagine your death day is tomorrow, September 9th, 2024. You will die. And you know it's coming. What do we need to do? What are we going to do? Will you pray? Will you ask for forgiveness? Tomorrow you die. Have you been saved? Because tomorrow you die. Will you beg God for forgiveness tonight before you go to sleep? Will you open up your Bible and read and read? Will you tell people you love them? Will you study the Bible with your children? Will you be a better father, a better mother, a better son or daughter, a better friend, a better servant to God if you knew you were dying tomorrow? If I'm dying tomorrow, I'm praying tonight. I'm praying the rest of the day. I'm begging God and pleading with God for forgiveness. If tomorrow were your death day, what do you need to do right now as we stand and sing?